Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 2 of Heart Matters with Father Norm and Gino. I'm Gino.
And I'm Father Norm, and it's good for both of us to be here with you.
All right, so our first episode, we talked about how we met. We talked about how we got here. And this episode is entitled The Worlds That Shape Us. And so we're going to talk a little bit this time about our backgrounds and where we come from and those formative adolescent years a little bit. And so let's start with you.
Okay.
How about you tell the folks where you're from and where you were born and all those good fun facts.
Good starting point that shapes us for a lifetime. Yes, well, as you know, real quick, going back even one generation, my mom was born in New York City. At the age of 18, though, she was fascinated by movies, films. She, on her own, in 1933, as an 18-year-old, went out to California and worked for 2 movie studios. Met my my biological dad there. They were married, and then after a few years, I came into being. She was pregnant with me. At that time, they were having a shaky marriage, and he just up and disappeared. You know, but my mom raised me as a single parent for about 4 years in Los Angeles, and then eventually came to Akron, Ohio through my stepdad, who was a school teacher from Akron, visiting out there. They met, they connected, and they came here. Just very quickly to say this about coming to Akron, when, as my mom would often tell me, she said, well, we left sunny California in the month of December and came to Akron, and my mother said, I wonder what I've done. You know, and that may have been an omen too, because one of the early things after we were here for maybe 3 or 4 years, my stepdad proved to be alcoholic, and so she raised me on my own, on her own, I guess you could say, on North Hill. That was my start.
North Hill. So for me, my mom was born in Akron, Ohio. My grandmother was born in Akron, Ohio, but her mother was actually born in Georgia. In Rome, Georgia. She was born in 1912. And so several years later, she moved up to Ohio, first Cincinnati, and then from Cincinnati up to Akron. And she had 6 children, and the youngest being my grandmother, and then my mom, and then me. My mom had me with my biological father, but I didn't know him growing up. And so my stepfather was the one that was in the house from when I was around 4. We lived on the west side of Akron, first on Copley Road, then shortly after that we moved in with my grandmother, and then out with my stepfather to Kenmore, but then I went back to my grandmother. So we moved around a little bit, and then my mom kind of moved around too. There was a point in time where she lived on the west side. There was another point in time where she lived on the east side on Herbridge over kind of Firestone Park area. But yeah, so I had like these different, kind of connections to a little bit of pieces of Akron. And I bring up my great grandmother into it because though we all grew up in Akron, there was still like a lot of Southern like connection and culture that was embedded in our family because of my grandmother's roots. So, yeah, no, I think that's a good. So you came to North Hill. What year was that?
Well, I would have come to, I think, 1952. I was born in 47, so I remember 52, just in time to go to kindergarten at Finley Grade School on North Hill. It's still there. They rebuilt it, and then Jennings and North High.
Nice. So what did North Hill? So I know, like, I had cousins that went to Finley, and I had cousins that lived on North Hill, and so I remember what it looked like when I was a kid. But what did that look like when you were a kid? What did that?
Well, yeah, and I don't know if you pointed that out. I'm grateful you didn't, but I'm 40 years older than
Really?
you.
I couldn't tell.
Yeah, right, thanks.
Yeah.
And I'm the white-haired one. And anyway, yeah, so 1952. A couple things about that were a big influence for me in North Hill. My mom gets there with me, and then and my stepdad, they weren't divorced. She didn't get any money and everything, so lived pretty simply. She didn't make that much money. So we, over the course of time, we lived in 3 different apartments. Always in apartments like the first one, the landlady was below us. The second one, we were on the 3rd floor of an old house that was converted into 4 families living, and we were in the attic. And then the third place was down the street from that, over a bar. So interesting places to grow up. But right away, that kind of influenced and colored me and how I looked at everything. I think one of the things, in addition to living in those kind of situations, I was probably pretty content with that. A lot of people say, you live like that. But for me, a pretty positive person, and my mom was always a presence, and she meant so much. And the neighborhood when I was there, now this was, again, you talk about the early 1950s, was mainly white, you know, but within the next 2 or 3, 4 years, North Hill, where we lived, that part of the hill where we lived, eventually became what the language of the day was, changing neighborhood, which meant more black people were moving in, more white people were moving to Talmadge or other areas. And so so when I went through grade school, pretty much the grade school that I was in, early grades, was pretty much white with a few black friends. But by the next 4 or 5 years later, most of my friends were black. In fact, they were all black in my Boy Scout patrol. And for me, that was natural and normal because I just loved knowing people. And at least when a little kid, I didn't think about what color are you or what your background is.
Yeah, I think when I was a kid, I never thought about that either. I never thought about race. I know for me, I can remember a specific time where I did become aware of it. Do you feel like there was a specific moment or time where, or maybe even just a story that you remember where you felt like, oh, like there is a difference, or there is something there that maybe, you know, I didn't, as a kid, I wasn't sensitive to now?
Yeah, aware of. Yeah, no, one that stands out for me all these years is that when I would walk home from school, from middle school, Jennings, and move toward Howard Street in a given direction, and the direction I moved in, almost all my friends in that neighborhood where I lived were black. The white kids tended to go the other direction. So I remember my mom talking to me one time and saying, oh, you know, my hairdresser was talking to me about a situation I wanted to bring up with you. And she was saying it very positively. And I said, oh, what? She said, well, my hairdresser, who lived on the route, but more in the white section, and then eventually moving to black, where she would see me come home, and the hairdresser, and she would say, gee, Norm is with all they probably would have used colored or Negro or whatever, but I use the language, black friends. It just seems like he's the only white guy there. And the hairdresser was a little concerned. What did that mean? What was that all about? My mom was great. She came from diversity in Los Angeles and New York before that. So she said, well, they tend to be friends going off in the same direction. And for me, when my mom even brought it up, I thought, well, why? Even all the time I walked with them, I didn't look around and say, oh, by the way, I'm the only white guy in this group. I just didn't think that way. If somebody would have asked, but it was only then when my mom brought up with the hairdresser, and I even had to say to my mom, well, what's the issue there?
Mm-hmm. And what did that interaction look like? I know, so you were friends, did that mean like you were like outside playing with one another, or was it to the degree where, you know, you were eating meals with one another and you were in each other's houses, or what did that dynamic look like for you as a kid and interacting with these kids that look different than you.
Right, right. Well, again, and this was probably we're getting about fourth or fifth, sixth grade, where that interaction was going on, and one factor there was I joined a Boy Scout troop, and the Boy Scout troop had 3 patrols. 2 of them were all white because they came out of what was a white-sponsored church. One of them was all black, except me, because the scoutmaster said, well, almost like naturally, well, aren't you going to be in one of these other patrols? Again, I didn't get it, or maybe I was starting to get it. I said, well, these are my friends. Why wouldn't I want to be in this? Although I was the only white guy and black. And of course, the one thing I remember, we teased each other, not nearly with the prejudice they would deal with, because they would call me Snowflake, and that's still, I still see some of my buddies, oh, Snowflake, I haven't seen you in 50 years. Thanks. But anyway, so there was humor and there was a spirit there. There's other things too, if you want me to mention, but right there was natural. One of my best friends was in the patrol. My mom worked nights, at 2 nights a week at a dry cleaner's establishment, and she'd say, well, I can put some food out for you to heat it up. They had Swanson TV dinners or these things you could stick in the oven. But then I had my best friend at the time, Michael, said, hey, you can come down on Monday and Thursday to my house, see mom and dad and sister, and they'd just have these great family meals, and I would go down, and where they were, it was all black. My mom was cool about that, and it was just for me enjoyable. And in fact, my first experience of family life was with Michael and his family, because it was just my mom and me, which was wonderful, but it wasn't the image of family that I had until I was down there.
That's so interesting. It's interesting for me because I like history, and I study these type of things, and it's interesting to, like, I've read about how African American kids were, kind of outcasted from Boy Scouts and things like that. But to know somebody who lived in those times and to have, that experience with what that practically looked like, I feel like is a powerful thing for sure. I think for me, same, for me, so I lived on the west side of Akron growing up. I went to St. Mary's Elementary School, where at a time where it was pretty diverse. It was actually the majority of the kids there, I believe, were African American, and then there was a small group. It was a good amount of white folks that came to our school as well, but they all kind of came from these separate Catholic families, and they were kind of spread out throughout the grade levels and things like that. And but I also remember, like, we had kids at our school that were from, like, North Korea, South Korea. We had kids that were from the Philippines. We had one kid that was from Mother Teresa's orphanage, and we had, like, all these different, we had folks who were from South America, and so we had a lot of immigrant. Now looking back, I knew that I can tell now that they were immigrant families, but I didn't know that they were immigrant families at the time. Like you said, I was just a kid, just growing up.
Sure.
You play outside, you play football, and all these other things. And so there was a large part of the time where diversity was normal for me. And it was modeled in a very organic way. It wasn't like we didn't have to talk about it. It was just kind of the part of it. But I did notice differences. I noticed, these folks' lunch didn't look the same as mine, or their language that they would speak, even when they did speak English, there was like a little different, tone to it, or those different type of things I did pick up on. But I can specifically remember one instance where, and I believe I was in kindergarten. I was either kindergarten or first grade. And we were riding to school. At the time, we had moved to Kenmore. This was during the time that we moved to Kenmore on Tampa Avenue. And we were driving to school, to St. Mary's. And when we moved to Kenmore, I should say that we were like the only black family on our street and in our neighborhood for a long time. And so I remember people, little, like, kids mentioning, oh, this is the black family,
Yeah,
or this kid's from
the black family. Yeah.
the black family in the neighborhood. And I remember we left and we were driving to school, and there was a guy on a motorcycle who was driving like up next to us. And I remember I was, as a kid, just thinking like, oh, it's a motorcycle, like that's cool. Like, let me wave to him. And so I, get in the window and I waved to him, and he gave me a middle finger. Now at the time, I had never seen a middle finger, never knew what a middle finger meant or any of that other type of stuff. And so I just remember being really, really confused. And I remember pulling into the St. Mary's parking lot, and my stepdad was driving, and I asked him, I said, and I did it. I said, what does this mean? He was like, who told you that? Like, who taught you that? And I was like, there was a guy on a motorcycle that did that to me when I waved to him. And I remember him being really, really upset. But it was the first time that I remember, like, oh, like something happened to me because of something that that I had no connection or recollection of. And I feel like that was colored by different experiences after that as well.
That reminds me too of another experience where by this time I was more aware of color and the prejudice. And as I mentioned, I was in a Boy Scout troop. I was the only white kid. We had a great bunch, and we were one of the times where I rented with my mom. We were on the second floor of the landlady's house. She wasn't home. And so I said, oh, I'll get some of my Scout patrol, and they all happen to be black, to come over and at my place on the second floor. Nobody else is there, and I wanted to be able to welcome, because I'd gone to so many of their houses. But having a sense of race for this, very conscious back then, that on the one side of the house there was a family, wonderful, warm family, all white. I was friends with their son, and we got along well. On the other side of the house was a woman, I still remember, I can still see her, that I knew she was very prejudiced. I knew she did not like black people. I knew that bothered her, and sometimes I'd hear her say, oh gee, more and more of them are coming into the neighborhood, and I wouldn't even, who's them? And then they would tell me. So I became more conscious. Wow, and she was a nice lady, a good neighbor and everything, but with that attitude. So I knew I couldn't go in through the front door to go up to the second floor, because she'd see who I was bringing in. And so what I did, I knew in the basement there were windows, and I brought all my black friends in through the basement window next to the house that was friendly and open and inclusive, and we all came in and then came up to the second floor. And I can remember we were laughing about it, and oh, this crazy and everything, and it almost felt like an adventure, going in there, and so the other woman wouldn't see us. And that's kind of how I remembered it, of course. And you may be able to identify with this, because we were all laughing and everything, but I know later some of my black friends look back on it differently than I was still. Oh, it was an adventure. And well, yeah, your comment, what do you think about that?
That reminds me of a story of when I first moved to Canton. And the reason why I moved to Canton was to help plant this church. That was a neighborhood church in the heart of the community that I still, have a lot of work and things in. But when I initially got there, I remember I think it was Mike Brown. It was right after the Mike Brown situation, and the first time that I ever...
Yeah, excuse me, mention, some people may not know what the Mike Brown situation was.
Yeah, so Mike Brown was a kid who was murdered by a police officer, unarmed, and it was really one of the first initial events in the social dynamic and political dynamic to where police brutality started to be more and more within the scope, and also because it was happening on the back of the boom of social media. And so like a lot of the attention and things going viral at that time, it was kind of was like the perfect storm for it to become national news. And so I had already committed to coming down before all that happened. But once I got down here, all of that happened. And the first time that I was on the stage was a panel discussion. And we were talking about the dynamics of race and just a theological framework for why everybody should care. And I remember also on the back of this, there was one of my friends, Fred, who actually lives a couple houses down from me now. But he's a giant of a man. He's like 6'7", like 350 pounds, and that's probably generous. He's a big guy. And I remember we went to go have lunch, or we went to go grab some food at Hibachi. You know, they sit you out. And so it was just me and him. So they sat us with this bigger family. So he went in first, he sat down, I sat down next to him, and then this family, this white family comes in, and they are all like filing in, but they're filing in on the opposite side of us. So they sit down, another guy sits down, all the way till it gets to me. And there's one seat, but there's two people, and they're literally arguing in front of us because they don't want to sit next to me. And I look at my buddy Fred, and we just laugh. Like, it was just, we thought it was hysterical. And so I'm on the panel of the conversation, and I'm reiterating this story. I'm telling this story over again, and we laugh again. Fred's in the audience, he laughs. There's other people in the audience, everybody's laughing. And Cynthia, who was next to me, another African-American woman, she was sitting next to me. She didn't laugh. She was the only person in the room that didn't laugh. She waited till all of the laughter stopped, and she said, yeah, we have to laugh because laughter for us takes some of the sting away. And I like sat back in my seat, and I was like, oh wait, that is why I laugh. Oh wait, I do that all the time. And I realized, and it's not even just me, but you know, me and you've had private or other conversations about comedians and our love for comedians. But you know, if you go through the lineage of comedians within the African American community, a lot of their jokes are centered around trauma and African American trauma, whether that's corporate or you know, community or communal trauma or individual traumatic experiences and things like that. And they make it funny because laughter does take a little bit of that that sting away. When
you look at that now, let's say in situations, and I get it, and as I said, I think I learned that from seeing a couple of my friends from way back when we were in 7th grade coming through the basement of that house years later, and we talked about it, you know, like let's look back, and that's where I learned, because again, being a white guy, I wasn't thinking anything of it. I mean, it was funny, I mean, I knew it wasn't right, but it didn't sting me, you know, and then for me to hear just maybe really about 3 or 4 years ago with a very good friend of mine from grade school saying, well, you know, Norm, that really hurt. Probably didn't think about it as much at the time, but did. And saying as a black person, getting a little older and looking at that and not trying to be some victim, but on the other hand saying, yeah, that's not right. How and just laugh about it. No, I'm an adult now and I'm not going to do that because I don't want to see that happen to other people.
Yeah, because part of it is a survival mechanism, right? Like especially when those experiences are repetitive or like they keep happening and you experience those things over and over again, those experiences validate each other. And then you start to, if those experiences start to validate themselves, then you start to build a framework, right? My buddy Bryson, who works at Malone, he's a professor in sociology, and he's way smarter than I am. But he said something years ago that really stuck with me and still resonates. He said, you know, it's like a triangle. There's at the top for us, it's scripture, but whatever is the moral guiding force for folks, it's their North Star of kind of like their morality. There's that. And then there's people's experiences. And so people's experiences and their moral North Star are the things that help shape their worldview, right, and their perspective. But he said outside of that one side of the triangle, there is experiences. And there is reality. right? And reality is those experiences or the reality that exists outside of my experiences and outside of my North Star. And so even for us, right, there's parts of our worldviews that connect, but there's also parts of our worldview that probably are separate and different, but that's because your experiences are different than mine, my experiences are different than mine, the things that have shaped your moral compass and your North Star are probably different than mine. But the problem becomes when we become so entrenched in that one side of the triangle that it makes us close off to other people's realities. And so for me, I think that's one of the things that I've always, I guess, kept a hold of is I wanted to be very interested intentionally in people's experiences that were different than mine. And so for you, maybe that's a good question. For you, like when you look at, from your mom and your experience, even really, really young in California, but then moving here to Akron, having the dynamic of the neighborhood and those experiences that have shaped that, and then even fast forward to hearing some of those stories and things like that, what parts or what are the things that you feel like back then that you still hold on to that have maybe even shaped the man that you have become or even are still becoming?
Yeah. Well, I think for one thing, even with my friends there and even in high school, sometimes talking with black friends, what was striking to me, a lot of times my white friends who lived on the other side of North Hill and had gone to grade schools that were predominantly white, and they would hear me talking openly with some of my black friends, and even back then, I know it's still, I don't know if it's an issue because I understand how people congregate, but there would be the black kids sitting over here in the cafeteria and the white kids sitting over here in the cafeteria, and some of that still goes on. And I said, it's not necessarily all bad. You're with people you like, but on the other hand, and I remember talking with some of my friends, and one things that shaped me is because even then and even now, people will say to me, how is it if you're talking to somebody black, let's say this is a white friend. I remember this one time, a white friend coming in to a gathering in the community, and I'm talking with a buddy, and we're kidding around in a good, healthy way, and the white guy says, whoa, how can you talk like that, like about race? You're not going to talk about race with somebody a different color. I said, hey, it's my background. I'm used to it. This is natural. I understand why it's not natural to you, because for a lot of white people, they've never had a really deep heart-to-heart conversation with anybody black.
Yeah, and I think that was, for me, eye-opening because so a little bit, we've talked about me being a pastor, but not the context in which I pastored. And so though I moved to Canton to pastor this church that was fairly diverse, there was another church that I began to pastor, and that's a story for another day, but it was an all-white, fairly conservative church in a all-white town that was historically known for being a racist town. I was the first African-American pastor in that city's history.
Yeah.
And so but then in that, as I began to pastor during these times of these Mike Browns and Trayvon Martins and Philando Castile and all these different type of things, I started to realize that there are, again, to the same point, people are oftentimes shaped by their experiences. And if those experiences exclude experiences of people that don't look like them or don't come from the same backgrounds as them, then they typically start to shape their worldview in a bubble, right? Yeah. And then that actually is the thing that closes them off from being connected to people, to being able to expand their worldview, to be able to include other people's reality. And so, I think to your point, I think it's very crucial, and maybe this is a good closing point.
Yeah.
I think it's very crucial that as we talk about heart matters and we talk about connection and relationship and being more interested than trying to be interesting.
Yeah.
Right? Some of the groundwork for, I think, some of the connections, or for these type of connections to happen, are rooted in finding other people's stories, like listening to other people's stories.
Yes.
Because you can deny a theology, you can deny, you know, a worldview or a political side or whatever, but it's harder to deny people's experiences and people's stories. Yeah.
You know, that reminds me just briefly of when I look back at my younger self and talk to people there. I guess I want to re-emphasize all the more what you're saying. Hey, a real key for all of us, beyond even color, just what it means all to be human. How do we get to know and better understand what shapes somebody by their story, instead of, first of all, getting into a big fight over a political issue or whatever issue? Hey, help me to see in your story how you reach that, and to foster mutual understanding.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think we're out of time.
Oh yeah.
We could probably keep going for another
No kidding.
hour.
Hey, yeah, you want to talk 3 more hours?
Yeah, why not? But we want to thank you all for being with us again for episode 2. If you like this, share it, subscribe. If there's things that you would like for us to talk about, or questions that you might have that were prompted by our conversations, by all means, message us, put it in the comments, all that good stuff, and we'll try our best to, you know, talk about things that are relevant to the world out there.
And I just say amen and ditto.
So thank you for being with us. See you soon.